The gate that once welcomed travelers into the small settlement of Willow Bend now bore a grotesque message. Indian land. It read in jagged red paint that still dripped down warped planks. Hung from that same gate was a girl barely alive swaying in the hot August wind. Her name was Evelyn Hart, 19, barefoot, bloodied, and left as a warning. The settlement around her had been reduced to embers. Smoke curled from the remains of log cabins drifting across a broken fence line that no longer marked property but loss. What had once been rows of late corn now stood as charred stalks leaning like grieving mourners. Not a single bird called. The wind carried only ash and memory. Evelyn's body bore the signs of a brutal punishment. Her dress, a simple blue calico, was torn at the hem, dark with soot and dried blood. A deep gash at her temple had dried into a rust-colored trail down her jaw. Her wrists were bound with rough-cut rope high above her head, her weight sagging from the strain. Her boots had been taken her dignity too, but her chest still rose barely. She was alive, and that made the scene even more jarring. It wasn't justice. It was theater. A group of Comanche warriors stood just beyond the square, their horses chewing at brittle grass between scorched patches. Most watched in silence, but one tall, broad-shouldered, his face streaked with ochre paint, glanced at the others. "Let them see," he said with quiet authority. "Let them all remember what happens when white hands steal sacred ground." Another man, younger, shifted in his saddle. His gaze lingered on Evelyn. "She's just a girl," he said softly. "She wore the settler's dress," the elder replied. "She bears their guilt." There was a long pause. And then a third man stepped forward, slimmer than the others, wrapped in well-worn buckskin. His hair was tied with faded red cloth, and a knife hung from a leather belt at his hip. His name was Jonah. He was Comanche by name, but not always in spirit. His face was unpainted. His hands bore no war trophies. He stared at Evelyn for a long moment, the muscles in his jaw tightening. "She's still breathing," Jonah said. "Then let her die," slow someone snapped. "She's not dead," Jonah repeated firmer this time, "and neither are we." He stepped toward the gate, ignoring the gasps and warnings. One warrior moved to block him. "You sever that rope, and you sever your place in the circle," he warned. "There's no coming back from this." But Jonah said nothing. He reached the timber posts and began climbing the charred wood, creaking under his boots. Dust rained down. The air seemed to hold its breath. At the top, he balanced carefully and took his knife from its sheath. The steel glinted once in the light. Evelyn stirred her eyelid fluttering open for a split second before sliding shut again. With a clean, practiced pull, Jonah sliced through the rope. Evelyn fell limp as cloth, but Jonah caught her. He held her like a wounded bird, arms strong and sure, and then climbed back down the gate supports as murmurs rippled through the warriors behind him. One spat on the ground and turned away. Another cursed under his breath, but none stepped forward to stop him. Jonah didn't explain himself. He didn't look back. He walked through the burned-out village, stepping carefully over shattered glass, cracked beams, and the quiet ghosts of what had been. The scorched land didn't speak, but the silence roared. Evelyn's head lolled against his shoulder, her breath shallow and erratic. He found his horse near the remains of a water well. With practiced hands, he laid her gently across a worn bedroll slung behind the saddle. Her limbs dangled awkwardly, but he secured her, carefully tying one of his own blankets around her to cushion the ride. When Jonah mounted, Evelyn stirred again. Her voice was dry, barely audible. "Let me go," she rasped. He said nothing. She opened her eyes and caught sight of his face for the first time. The dark skin, the feathers tied behind his ear, the leather vest. Panic surged through her, and she recoiled violently, tumbling from the horse with a painful thud. She scrambled, half crawling through the dirt, dragging her battered legs toward the edge of the woods. Her hands scraped against rocks, her breath sharp and uneven. Jonah dismounted, slowly, walking after her. "Stay back," she hissed. She picked up a stone, swung it missed entirely. Her voice cracked. "Just kill me," she screamed, more anger than plea. "You savages already took everything." And then she collapsed, trembling face pressed into the dust. The stone rolled from her fingers. Jonah knelt beside her, not to bind her, not to scold. He simply brushed a bit of dirt from her cheek, his touch cautious, almost reverent. "You're not dead yet," he said softly. And without another word, he lifted her again, carefully, gently, and carried her into the trees. The fire still smoldered behind them, but they didn't look back. They were heading somewhere far from war, though neither yet knew if peace would follow. The forest swallowed them in green shadows and the hush of pine needles beneath hooves. Jonah rode eastward with Evelyn draped across his saddle, her weight slight but heavy with meaning. He didn't speak. Words weren't useful now. What mattered was distance from the burned houses, from the warriors, from the memory of rope. As the sun dipped behind the hills, the light thinned into cool gray. Jonah turned off the path and followed a stream until he found what he was looking for, a forgotten shelter half sunk into the ridge. Its roof was patched with bark and brush, the door barely hanging on its hinges. No one had lived here in years. That made it perfect. He dismounted, slowly, lifting Evelyn as though she might shatter. Her skin was hot, fever already. She didn't stir her lips dry and cracked her face streaked with ash and sweat. He carried her inside and laid her on a mat of old woven reeds, covering her with his spare blanket. The shelter smelled of damp wood and moss. Jonah moved carefully, starting a fire in the stone ring, pouring water from his canteen, soaking a cloth to press against her brow. His hands were steady. He'd done this before years ago with someone who hadn't survived. But this time he wasn't ready to lose. Night fell. The fire glowed soft and orange, casting flickering shapes on the walls. Jonah sat by the entrance, listening to the wind shift through the trees. Occasionally, Evelyn muttered something in her sleep, half-formed words, names maybe. He didn't listen too closely. Not yet. Just before dawn, she woke. She screamed. "Get away from me!" she shrieked, scrambling to the far wall. Her limbs failed her, one leg crumpling her side, flaring with pain, but she clawed backward, pressing into the wood as if she could vanish through it. Jonah didn't move. He set the wet cloth down and walked out of the shelter, leaving the door cracked behind him. Outside, he sat by the fire and waited. She didn't sleep again that night. Neither did he. By morning, she tried to run. He found her halfway down the hill, collapsed beside a dead log, her breath ragged. She had fallen hard dirt, and pine needles streaked across her dress. Her ankle was twisted. Her fingers scraped. When she heard him approaching, she curled up like a wounded animal. "Don't touch me," she rasped. He didn't. He waited beside her, his shadow long across the grass. When her strength was gone, when her breath grew too thin, she let him lift her again. There was no resistance this time, just silence. He carried her back. No chains, no commands, just steps. The second time she ran, it was near dusk. She made it farther, almost to the creek, but fainted at its edge. Jonah found her slumped in the mud, limbs tangled like roots. This time, she didn't speak at all. He cleaned the blood from her lip and gave her water. The third time she stayed, not because she trusted him, not because she believed she was safe, But because the pain had drained her anger, and with nothing left to fuel the fire, she sat in silence on her bed of reeds, shivering despite the heat of the flames. Jonah placed a wooden bowl of broth near her side. He didn't wait for thanks. He didn't expect it. Evelyn didn't eat at first. She just stared at the bowl, eyes dull with mistrust. Her wrist was swollen fingers, curled like she'd forgotten how to use them. After several failed attempts to grip the spoon, she let her arm drop. Jonah noticed. He picked up the spoon, dipped it carefully into the bowl, and blew gently across the surface. Then, hesitating only a moment, he held it to her lips. The first sip burned. The second settled easier. By the third, she let him feed her without flinching. It wasn't gratitude in her eyes, just exhaustion. "What's your name?" she asked quietly, voice like paper scraping. He looked at her surprised. "Jonah," he said. She nodded faintly. Her fingers twitched around the edge of the blanket. Outside, the pines rustled. Inside, Evelyn closed her eyes not from fear, but because warmth had finally reached some place deeper than her wounds. Not trust, not yet, but the shape of it. The days blurred after that, cool mornings, long silences, the smell of wood smoke clinging to everything. Evelyn healed in pieces. The bruises on her ribs faded from violet to yellow. The scabs along her cheek flaked away. But trust moved slower. It didn't come in neat lines. It came like fog, uncertain and shifting. She no longer screamed when Jonah entered. That was something. But her body still tensed whenever he moved too quickly or stood too close. Sometimes in the quiet moments, just before sleep, she would reach for a weapon that wasn't there. Habit, not hatred. Jonah didn't take it personally. Each morning, before the sun crept too high, he would leave the shelter to gather supplies, berries, roots, fresh water. When Evelyn opened her eyes, she would find something left beside the hearth, a strip of dried meat, a piece of firewood wrapped in cloth, or sometimes just a carved piece of bark shaped into a feather. He never explained these offerings. He just gave them. When she could finally stand without falling, she tried again to escape. Not out of fear, but out of sheer instinct. It was dusk when she crept out, limping toward the stream. Her ankle gave out halfway. She stumbled, catching herself against a rock, breathing hard through the pain. Jonah followed her tracks. He always did. When he found her, hunched by the water, her hands clutching her side, he didn't scold or carry her back. He just knelt nearby, watching the way her jaw trembled. "I don't understand you," she said, not looking at him. "Why do you keep helping me?" Jonah didn't answer right away. He picked up a twig and drew a slow line in the dirt. "Because someone should have helped me," he said simply. The words sat heavy between them. No echo, no apology, just truth. That night, Evelyn didn't speak, but she didn't curl against the far wall either. She sat near the fire, slowly sipping from her bowl. Her hand still shook as she lifted the spoon, but she didn't ask for help. Jonah sat across from her, his back against the timber wall, his face half lit by firelight. "Why are you out here alone?" she asked. He stirred the ashes with a stick, thoughtful. "Too many graves," he murmured. Evelyn flinched at that, at the quiet way he said it, as though each word had to climb out from under a weight. She pulled her blanket tighter, the stitches along the edge brushing her fingertips. "Not yours?" she asked. Jonah shook his head. "No," he said, "but I still carry them." They fell into silence again. But this time it felt different. Not strained, not hostile, like two people waiting in the same room for different kinds of pain to pass. The next morning, Evelyn stepped outside for the first time. Mist clung to the low trees, and the air carried the scent of wet pine. She stood still, bare feet against cold earth, watching Jonah hunched over a flat stone. He held a piece of wood in one hand, a knife in the other. But he wasn't cutting, he was shaping. The movement was slow, deliberate. She recognized the half-formed shape of a bird in the grain. Its wings weren't finished. Its head tilted upward as if about to lift. She didn't speak. Not yet. But something in her shifted. That afternoon, she picked up a small pile of firewood and carried it inside. Her ankle ached, her arms trembled, but she didn't fall. She set it gently by the wall and sat back. Jonah watched her from the corner. His knife paused mid-stroke. She didn't meet his eyes. But when the fire crackled and the scent of stew filled the shelter, she looked up and whispered, "Thank you." He didn't smile, not exactly, but the air between them softened. And when she accidentally spilled too much salt into the pot and muttered a curse under her breath, Jonah raised an eyebrow and said, "Bad magic." Evelyn laughed a short surprise sound that caught in her throat. She clapped a hand over her mouth, unsure if she was allowed to find humor in this place. Jonah just tilted his head slightly as if pleased and went back to carving. Days became a rhythm. Not of peace exactly, but of coexistence. Evelyn no longer reached for weapons. Jonah no longer kept his knife in hand when she stirred. They moved like two people surviving the same storm from opposite ends of the cabin. Not quite friends, not quite strangers. And then something shifted. It began with the carving. One morning, Evelyn stepped outside and saw the small wooden bird Jonah had been shaping, now resting on the flat stone beside the fire. The wings were half open, the neck tilted back as though waiting to rise. The feathers weren't precise, his blade left rough edges, but the form was unmistakably alive. She stared at it for a long time before sitting down beside it. Her fingers reached out, brushing the grooves in the grain, the way someone might touch a heartbeat through cloth. Later, when Jonah returned with a pouch of wild onions, he found her sitting by the fire with the bird in her lap. She didn't hide it. "If you carve me wings," she said softly, not looking up, "I'll try to fly." He didn't answer. But that night, when he set his tools down, his hands lingered on the unfinished feathers. The next day, Evelyn insisted on helping. She gathered firewood, not much, just a few pieces, and brought them in with a slow, steady limp. Her fingers were still swollen, her wrist wrapped in strips of cloth, but she didn't ask for help. She didn't want to be helpless anymore. Jonah said nothing. He just nodded once, approving but quiet. That evening, she stirred the pot while he chopped roots nearby. The warmth of the fire, the rhythm of simple chores, it felt like something domestic, almost ordinary. They didn't speak much, but the silence wasn't empty. It was shared. When Evelyn burned her tongue on the first spoonful, Jonah handed her a cool tin cup without a word. When Jonah forgot to stir the stew and it stuck to the bottom, Evelyn raised an eyebrow and muttered, "Tastes like revenge." Jonah chuckled, a soft, unused sound that made Evelyn glance up in surprise. "You do know how to laugh," she said. His lips twitched. "Once a year." The words were dry but gentle. She smiled not wide but real. Later, as they cleaned their bowls in the creek under a silver-blue sky, Evelyn asked the question that had lingered between them since the day he cut her down. "Why did you save me?" Jonah sat on a log, his hands still wet, rubbing his thumb against his palm as if smoothing something that wouldn't go away. "Because if someone had saved me..." He started, then paused. "Maybe I wouldn't be so good at being alone." Evelyn said nothing for a long time. The moonlight caught her hair, making it gleam like frost. When she finally looked up, her eyes weren't hard anymore, just tired. That night, she couldn't sleep. Her mind kept reaching back to the day her world ended. The fire, the screaming, her sister's voice fading behind the cabin, the sound of her father's body hitting the floor. She lay awake until the embers dimmed. Then she sat up across the cabin and rummaged through Jonah's spare supplies, scraps of hide bits of cloth broken buttons. Jonah watched her from the hearth, saying nothing. She selected a square of soft leather, sat near the fire, and began stitching. Her fingers trembled, her lines uneven. She pricked herself twice, but she kept going. She sewed a border slow and determined until it became something square and whole. When it was done, she looked up. "I've never sewn anything before," she said. "My mother did. I always thought I was too clumsy." Jonah tilted his head, studying it. "Looks whole to me," he said. She smiled, small, uncertain. Then, without explaining, she took the needle again and stitched one last thing into the corner Jonah. She held it out to him. He didn't take it right away, just looked at it like it might crumble. Then, slowly, he reached for it and folded it as carefully as one might fold a prayer. And for the first time he said her name. Evelyn. She met his eyes across the fire. No longer just a girl who had been left to hang. No longer just the man who cut her down. Two survivors. Two people reshaping what life meant, not through grand gestures, but through small acts of meaning stitched by hand, carved from grief. The cold came sooner than expected that year. Wind swept down from the hills, brushing through the trees like a warning. The shelter creaked under the weight of early frost, the fire burning lower each night, tighter, closer to the heart of the cabin. Evelyn sat wrapped in a patched hide blanket Jonah had repaired just days earlier. Her knees drawn to her chest, eyes tracing the dancing firelight. She had been quiet all morning, more than usual. Jonah, seated beside her, knife in hand, worked slowly on the carved bird. The wings were almost finished now, lines, clean edges, smooth. She didn't look at him when she spoke. "They killed my parents," she said softly, her gaze locked on the hearth. "Not like in a battle, not even in a raid. They just walked into the cabin and shot my father while he was tending the stove. My mother screamed. They dragged her outside, cut her throat." Jonah paused, his knife still in the wood, but he didn't interrupt. "My sister, 14, she ran. They caught her. I still don't know if she's alive." Evelyn's voice trembled but didn't break. "I hid in the root cellar. I watched through a crack while they burned the Thompsons in their cabin across the way. Mr. Thompson was trying to cover his baby with his coat. Didn't matter. They all burned." She looked over at Jonah, now her eyes dry but blazing. "They painted the door with blood. I can't forget the smell." Jonah slowly set down the carving. "I wasn't there," he said, his voice low, steady, "but my people were." She stiffened. The quiet snapped. "I was 5 when the Comanche took me," he continued. "I don't remember my real parents. Just fire screaming, and then nothing. A woman raised me. She had no sons. So I became hers." Evelyn's brows furrowed. "But you don't look—" "I never fully belonged," he said. "Too pale, eyes too light, skin not dark enough. Some called me ghost, some called me curse, but I learned to ride, to hunt, to speak their words, and they let me stay." He leaned back against the wall, exhaling. "You asked why I helped you," he said, glancing at the stitched cloth she'd given him. "It's because I know what it's like to be stolen, to survive not because someone saved you, but because they needed another hand with the firewood." Evelyn didn't respond at first. She stared into the flames again, her hands clutching the blanket. Then she stood. She walked across the room to the small pile of supplies Jonah kept tucked away, scraps of leather sinew, pieces of bark, and an old bone needle. She sat beside them, threading with slow, deliberate movements. Her fingers still bore bruises, but they didn't shake now. Jonah didn't speak. He watched. She stitched a handkerchief again. This time, neater, stronger. Then she added one more word in blocky, uneven letters at the edge. Stay. She held it out. It's not much, she said, but it's the first thing I've made that wasn't just to survive. Jonah took it gently, folding it with the same care he showed the first. That evening, the fire burned brighter. They sat shoulder to shoulder, the quiet no longer empty, but filled with shared breath. And then, in the stillness before dawn, came the hoof beats. Jonah felt them first, a tremble in the ground, a vibration in the wind. He stood slowly, shoulders tensed, eyes locked eastward. Evelyn stepped outside with a woven basket in her arms, pausing at his side. "What is it?" she asked. He didn't answer. From the mist they emerged 6 riders, painted faces, bone necklaces, fringe catching the wind. Comanche warriors, his people, the ones who had left him behind. One dismounted. Older, hard eyes. "You're not forgotten, Jonah," he said in Comanche, "nor forgiven." Jonah stood his ground. "I left the war behind," he replied. The man pointed at Evelyn. "You hid what we marked. She was left to burn. You stole justice." "She was ash," Jonah said, "not fire." Another warrior stepped forward, rage thick in his voice. "She is the stain that says we failed. The line must hold." Jonah moved in front of Evelyn, shielding her with his body. "You won't touch her." The blow came fast. A fist, a spear haft. The strike to his ribs knocked the breath from him. Evelyn screamed. They hit him again, 2, 3 of them. He staggered, blood spilling from his mouth. Still, he held his ground. "She is mine to protect," Jonah roared. "Not yours to finish." But he was outnumbered. They dragged him by the arms' heels, scraping lines in the dirt. Still, he shouted over his shoulder, "Evelyn, run." She did. Not far, not blindly. She ran to the ravine, to the cave behind the mossy stones where they'd once gathered herbs. She pressed herself into the shadows, breath shaking hands over her mouth to stifle sobs. Hoofbeats thundered, shouts rose, then faded. Silence followed. When she finally returned to the shelter, Jonah was crumpled near the fire pit. Blood streaked his temple. His chest barely moved. Evelyn dropped beside him, hands shaking. "You stayed," he whispered, then went still. The next hours came like a blur. Evelyn couldn't afford to cry. Not yet. Jonah's skin burned with fever, and blood clung to his scalp like dried paint. His breathing was shallow, strained. He didn't open his eyes again that night. She pressed cool cloths to his forehead, whispered his name, tried herbs she only half remembered from watching him. Nothing worked. His fever climbed higher. His body twitched with pain. By the 4th day, she was out of options, so she packed. She slung a leather satchel over her shoulder, tied Jonah's knife to her hip, and set off before sunrise. Her legs ached. Her ankles still throbbed from weeks ago, but she didn't stop. She moved through thorns, foraged at stream edges, scraped willow bark with bleeding hands. A snake hissed nearby once, but she didn't flinch. She returned by moonlight arms, full of herbs, roots, and river moss. She boiled everything together, the air thick with bitter steam, and spooned it into Jonah's mouth, one drop at a time. When she couldn't feed him, she sang softly old songs without lyrics, just breath and rhythm. "Stay," she whispered over and over like prayer. At dawn, his eyes opened, red-rimmed, unfocused, but awake. "You came back," he rasped. "I never left," she said, and this time the tears fell freely. When Jonah's fever finally broke, he slept. Not the fevered, thrashing kind, real sleep. Restorative. And when he woke again, the scent of healing smoke still clung to the walls, the fire still warm. Evelyn was sitting beside the hearth, her knees tucked to her chest. She was thinner now. her hair tangled, her eyes sunken from worry. But she hadn't left. Their gazes met, no words at first. Then she poured him water, brought the tin cup to his lips. He drank slowly, flinching at the bitter herbs but finishing every drop. "You called my name," she murmured, "even when you were barely breathing." He let his head fall back against the mat, his chest rising steadily now. "I could hear it," she added. "Even when I was hiding, I could still hear you." Jonah said nothing. He didn't need to. In the weeks that followed, they rebuilt first his body, then the shelter. Jonah healed gradually. Evelyn helped him sit upright, changed his bandages, and lit the fire before the morning frost could creep in. She never spoke of leaving, not once. Each dawn she would find something left just outside the door, a feather wrapped in sinew, a clay pot with a young sprout peeking through soil, a stone etched with birds, one flying, one resting. And then, one morning, the wooden bird was complete. Its wings spread wide, head-lifted eyes full of movement, carved from stillness. She held it in both hands, fingers tracing every detail, every curve. Inside, Jonah sat by the hearth, a blanket over his shoulders. Their eyes met again. This time, no doubt lingered between them. Evelyn placed the bird gently on the shelf above the fire. Then she sat beside Jonah, shoulder to shoulder, no longer across the room, no longer afraid. It wasn't debt, it wasn't pity, it was choice. That spring, when the snow melted and the earth grew soft again, they tore down what was left of the old lean-to. Together, they began building something new. A cabin, stronger, broader, warmer. The logs were cut thick, the roof lined with bark and animal hide to guard against the wind. Every board passed through both their hands. Every stone in the hearth laid side by side. Evelyn dug the root cellar herself. Her palms blistered, but she gritted her teeth and kept going. Jonah carved the new door frame not with tribal markings, but with his own patterns, flowing lines, feathers, stitched borders. A language only they understood. And when the house stood whole and ready, no longer just a shelter, but a home, Evelyn found a scrap of pine. She sanded it, smooth, careful, and slow, and with the tip of Jonah's smallest blade she carved the words, "Home of Evelyn and Jonah, where no one is left hanging." She nailed it above the door herself. A few weeks later they found the child. They had wandered deeper into the woods in search of honeycomb when they heard the crying, high-pitched, rhythmic cutting through the wind. Beneath a collapsed wagon, half buried in leaves, lay a boy no older than 5. His clothes were shredded, his face smeared with mud and a dark welt on his brow. He didn't speak, not the first day, not the second. They brought him home, fed him, let him sleep curled beside the hearth. On the 4th morning, when Evelyn offered him a wooden cup, he reached for her hand and whispered, "Anina." She froze. It was Comanche, Mother. Later that week, when Jonah helped him fix a broken wheel on a toy cart, the boy mumbled, "Panna." Jonah blinked, and then nodded. Father. They never asked where he came from, never forced him to recount what he had seen. It was enough that he laughed eventually, enough that he learned the alphabet as Evelyn drew it on bark with charcoal, enough that he slept between them and stopped flinching in his dreams. They planted corn that year, built a chicken coop, sang wordless songs at twilight, and every night, under a sky full of stars, the child curled between them like something they'd always been waiting for. The seasons passed quietly, carving their stories into the land one soft breath at a time. The house on the ridge, once made of salvaged beams and hope, grew into something rooted. Travelers sometimes passed through, fur traders, lost settlers, women with bruised histories, a man who had buried too many children. All were welcomed. None were questioned. The child, whom they named Caleb, grew strong beneath the sun. He called Evelyn Mama Ev and Jonah simply Pa. He laughed often, ran fast, learned the names of herbs and stars. At night, he would curl between them, pointing to constellations as Jonah gave them names in Comanche, old and sacred. Evelyn kept drying herbs above the hearth. Jonah still carved birds, though his hands began to tremble more with age. Caleb would try to imitate him, whittling clumsy wings from bark that never quite took flight, but Jonah always smiled and said, almost. They were not a family born of blood, but of fire and second chances. Then, one autumn, the men in polished boots came, 6 of them. Mounted on fresh horses, wearing brass buttons and carrying papers rolled tight in leather cases. Government men, railroad surveyors. Their voices were clipped and formal, their boots too clean for this land. They dismounted near the clearing and approached the cabin with rehearsed smiles. This land sits directly in the proposed path of the Trans-Western Line, said the eldest, tapping a folded map. We're prepared to offer fair compensation. Progress is coming either way. Evelyn stood in the doorway, her hands dusted with flour, a warm scent of bread rising from within. Her hair had silvered at the temples, but her spine was as straight as the day she carved the sign. She didn't respond immediately. Instead, she gestured behind her to the home that had taken years to build. That roof was stitched after a war, she said calmly. Those walls were raised by hands that used to bleed. We didn't build this on land. We built it on grief and grace. The men exchanged looks. Some scoffed. One stepped forward. We understand your sentiment, Mrs. Hart. You don't? Came Jonah's voice from behind her. He stepped into view, broad and silent. His face had deepened with years, but his presence had not dimmed. He stood beside her like stone. Jonah didn't raise his voice. He didn't threaten. He just looked out toward the trees where Caleb had worn a path from years of running. Then he looked at Evelyn. She gave a small nod. The men left within the hour. 1 week later, a new sign was hammered just beyond the ridge trail near where the wildflowers still bloomed between the stones. It read, not Indian land, not white land, just loved land. And below it, in Evelyn's careful hand, we already found what we were looking for. The years rolled forward like river stones polishing time into memory. The house became more than a home, it became a haven. Word spread. Women fleeing bruises arrived with children. Boys with broken voices found shelter by the fire. An old blacksmith who had lost everything slept peacefully beneath the stars for the first time in years on their land. Evelyn taught them to plant. Jonah taught them to listen to the earth. Caleb, grown, now taught the youngest to read and draw maps. And every night stories were told beneath the old oak, some true, some softened by time, but all kept the fire alive. And in that cabin, long after the land had been mapped and the railways had bent around the ridge instead of cutting through it, Evelyn and Jonah remained. Gray-haired, slow-moving, still reaching for each other's hands in the quiet moments. On summer nights, they sat in rocking chairs outside the cabin while Caleb's children played nearby. You gave me more than a home, Evelyn whispered once, her hand brushing the old scar near Jonah's temple. You gave me back my life. Jonah didn't reply with words, just a soft grunt, a familiar sound. It meant, I know. It meant, thank you. It meant, yes. They were never buried beneath marble stones. But long after they passed, the cabin stood. The hearth still burned. Travelers still found the path. They still paused at the carved sign, not Indian land, not white land, just loved land. And sometimes they cried. Because in a world broken by borders, hatred, and blood, someone once had built something else. A life not claimed by war, but offered freely. a place where no one was left hanging. And that was enough. Out here, in the dust and distance of old America, we tell tales that are more than romance. We tell stories of redemption, of loyalty, and lawless places of hands held after heartbreak. Stories where love does not ask for permission, it just stays. If you believe that even the most broken places can grow something whole again, if you believe in love that defies borders, history, and hate, then don't just watch. Ride with us. Subscribe to Whispers of the Wild West. Like this video and share it with someone who still believes in second chances. Because in the Wild West, love isn't always easy, but it's always worth it.